الو 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 تمام.
سوريا سوريا تمام
استنى في واحدة اللي وانا جاء لا لا
ممكن بس المايكات تكون اوطى شويه ما تكون كميتها عاليه. ايه على نفس المدى تقريبا ما تكون عاليه. قصدك هذا؟ لا هذا لهون اذا ترانزليشن بس هذا شويه صغيره صح؟
الو. الو ما في صوت ابدا. تيست واحد اثنين. تيست واحد اثنين.
sehr geehrter. Okay. And I will need this. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming here today. The High Commissioner arrived in Damascus yesterday. He has met a range of actors, including officials, civil society, diplomats, UN colleagues, as well as victims of human rights abuses. Now the visit is concluded, he will share an end-of-mission statement with you, which will be available also online. After he delivers this, we'll take questions, 3 at a time. We only have a limited amount of time as we need to leave shortly after this. Thank you.
Well, Messer here, thanks for coming. This is a historical first. Never before has there been a visit by a United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner to Syria. I've been impressed by the bravery, the fortitude and the resilience of the Syrian people I have met, given the atrocities and trauma they have experienced over the years. It has been indeed a very emotional moment to listen to many of them and to their plight. My office, the UN Human Rights Office, has worked over the past 14 years monitoring, documenting and publishing numerous reports to bring to the world's attention the extremely serious human rights situation in Syria and to call for accountability despite being denied access to the country. During my visit, I heard from a number of victims. One, a former soldier suspected of being a defector who was jailed at the notorious Sednaya prison, where we have been documenting violations for years. He told me of the cruel treatment he endured. I cannot even bear to share the stories of beatings and torture that he shared with me. He, like the thousands of others, held and disappeared there and in so many other facilities for decades past, was crammed into a freezing cell with dozens of others sharing only a few blankets. Early in the morning, as they heard the guards at their door, trembling in fear, they retreated to the rear of the cell, fearing they would be hauled out again to be tortured or, worse, even executed. Thousands that died in prisons throughout the country. I also visited the residential neighborhood of Jobar in Damascus, which now resembles what can only be described as an apocalyptic wasteland. Not a single building in the area was spared bombardment in wave after wave attacks. It is inconceivable that such mass killings and destruction took place. Equally, that banned chemicals were used against civilians elsewhere in the country, and not just once, says a lot about the extreme brutality of the tactics used by the former regime. Such acts constitute the most serious crimes under international humanitarian law. I've heard from the victims and from civil society groups representing them about their immediate needs, but also about their long-term aspirations. Despite the misery inflicted upon them, they speak of their relief, but also of their hopes for the future. And in Damascus, I witnessed how people were busy going about their daily lives, shopping at the markets, drinking coffee, visiting places of worship, children playing outside. But there is so much to be done. And this is such an important moment with tremendous challenges and risks ahead. The people of Syria need every ounce of help they can get to rebuild a country that works for all Syrians. I came here to offer my reassurances that my office, the Human Rights Office of the United Nations, will continue to support inclusive, nationally owned and nationally driven processes. There are still very real threats to Syria's territorial integrity, independence and sovereignty, which must be fully respected and rigorously upheld. The ongoing conflicts and hostilities must end. During the visit, I met the leader of the caretaker authorities, Ahmed al-Shara. He acknowledged and assured me of the importance of respect for human rights for all Syrians and all different components of Syrian society, as well as the pursuit of healing, trust building and social cohesion and the reform of institutions. We discussed the opportunities and challenges awaiting this new Syria. Human rights must be at the front and center, where everyone can live free and equal in dignity and rights. But the challenges are immense. The first task must be saving lives. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. Much of the country lies in ruins. 90% of the population is mired in poverty. The health system is on its knees, and many schools are closed. Millions are still displaced, both inside and outside the country. The rights to food, health, education, and housing are fundamental human rights, and there must be prompt, collective, and concerted efforts to guarantee them. As the international community considers the issue of sanctions, it will be critical to bear in mind the impact that sanctions have on the lives of the Syrian people. I therefore call for an urgent reconsideration of sectoral sanctions with a view to lifting them. To move forward, it is critical to address the past wrongs that have been committed by all actors in Syria over the past 5 decades. Those responsible for serious human rights violations and crimes must be held to account. Concerns of the most serious war crimes and even crimes against humanity have been documented over the years of conflict. The enforced disappearances, the torture, the use of chemical weapons, among other atrocity crimes, must be fully investigated. And then justice must be served, fairly and impartially. I have heard repeatedly from Syrians themselves that this is what they want. The extent of the atrocity crimes truly beggars belief. We will work in a complementary manner on these and other violations with the other human rights mechanisms that exist. As you know, the UN Commission of Inquiry, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, and the newly established institution on missing persons in Syria. In fact, this institution that has just started will work with families, victims groups, and the authorities to clarify the fate and the whereabouts of the enormous number of missing persons all across Syria and provide support to the relatives. Transitional justice is crucial as Syria moves forward. Transitional justice aims to provide recognition to victims. It enhances the trust of individuals in state institutions. It reinforces respect for human rights, and it promotes the rule of law. Revenge and vengeance are never the answer. Instead, there needs to be a fully nationally owned healing, truth-telling, and reconciliation process. My office is ready to support transitional justice initiatives as well as other rule of law efforts to move forward. We know that such processes have repeatedly demonstrated that they can help address grievances and divisions with a strong focus on the plight of victims. Women and girls face significant disparities in the country. If one looks at the data, it's clear that gender inequalities have further limited access to healthcare, to education and safe housing. Rebuilding a Syria that works for all its people, equal in dignity and without discrimination, will be key to its success and stability. My office envisages to continue its work on patterns affecting housing, land and property rights, particularly on how practices of demographic engineering have been infringing access for Syrians, particularly returnees and internally displaced people, to such basic rights. We have had a dedicated Syria team since 2013, operating from outside of the country due to the previous regime's refusal to allow us to work in Syria. Just 3 weeks ago, my colleagues were able to enter the country for the first time, and now we look forward to supporting Syrians, to supporting human rights of Syrians inside the country. It is really a seminal moment for Syria after decades of repression. My most fervent hope is for all Syrians to be able to thrive together, regardless of gender, religion, ethnicity, and to build a common future. Shukran.
Mr. Turk,
One minute, please.
So you will
so
moderate.
we'll take 3 questions at a time. You may ask the first one.
Salam from Al Jazeera. You've met the new administration and you have spoken of the importance of transitional justice. We've been around the country. They might have some expertise, but what do they need, especially in investigating the mass graves and the mass detention places? They would need the right technology and the right expertise to help them. Have the new administration spoke to you for help or asked from the UN for this help in this aspect, and are you willing to provide this help for the new administration? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Mr. Sanawi, TRT World. Over the past 14 years, many Syrians would say that they've been feeling left out by the world. We understand, of course, the restrictions imposed by the previous regime, the Assad regime. Now, my question is that, given the dire humanitarian crisis here across the country, what are the actual steps and measures you're starting to take to help people, especially in areas where there is limited or no international assistance? And one more thing about refugees, because we understand that millions of Syrians are still displaced, whether outside the country or internally. So are there actual measures to help these people rebuild or return to their homes, the things that they once called them home? Thank you.
سيف رزوق جريدة الوطن السورية. سيف رزوق جريدة الوطن السورية. تحدثتم عن تحديات الآن تواجه النساء السوريات. هل لاحظتم هناك تحديات أخرى تواجه المجتمع السوري الآن بعد مرحلة سقوط النظام؟
That's our 3
Yeah.
questions. Thank you.
Look, it is absolutely important in this transition phase to ensure that mass grave sites, documents, all possible evidence for atrocity crimes, for serious human rights violations are preserved. That's of the utmost importance. And it is clear that both my office, but also the other mechanisms that I have just mentioned, the IIIM, the independent institution that has been investigating crimes for the last couple of years, as well as the Commission inquiry, are able to do their job because they will want to work with the transition authorities precisely to do that. And that is going to be very important. And in my meetings with the leader of the caretaker authorities, we had agreed that we would indeed make sure that we have a work plan that will include transitional justice issues, and that we are able to re-establish ourselves in this country after such a long absence. And that's absolutely critical, and I'm very much looking forward to that. I think in the past, one of the big issues for my humanitarian colleagues in the UN was that there was an incredible amount of red tape to their humanitarian activities. As you know, the UN has been present inside the country for a long time, and I know from my humanitarian colleagues how often it took them 2 weeks to get authorizations. They needed to notify, sometimes deconfliction didn't work, all the nuts and bolts of humanitarian action. And today, you just can go wherever you want, and you are able to deliver. And I think that the big issue now is to make sure that we get the donor support that is needed for the humanitarian agencies to be able to have access everywhere, to be able to provide support, to be able to deliver on food. We have just had a high-level visit, including from the World Food Program, for example, and that's of the utmost importance. The work of my office is a bit different. We are not part of the humanitarian side. Our work is to ensure, and we have been doing this, as I mentioned during my remarks, our task has always been to bring to the world's attention the massive human rights violations that have occurred in this country for not just the last 14 years, but in particular the last almost 14 years, but even before then. On refugees, I mean, when it comes to refugee return, there are very clear principles. They need to be voluntary. It has to be based on voluntariness. It has to be based on a free and informed decision by people of whether or not they are able to go back. And it has to be managed in such a way that indeed early recovery can set in so that people are able to re-establish themselves. This is going to be a huge process. It will have to be managed both internally and externally, and it will depend very often also on people being able to have access to basic services. So from my own experience, I know that this can take some time, but it is absolutely clear that those Syrians who live outside, who want to return, who want to exercise their right to return, they should be able to do so. And the conditions for that need to be provided. So the challenge is, you know, I've had a chance now to meet with quite a lot of Syrians and civil society actors, former human rights defenders. Some of them already have come back. I felt a sense of relief, but also the need to work through the traumas of the past. And one aspect that was very clear to me was the need to find missing persons, to bring closure to the plight of missing people, but also to deal with the trauma of what people have gone through when they had been detained, for example, often under the most abominable circumstances. So there are huge challenges of healing, as I said, of inclusiveness, of bringing the society together, of social cohesion, and of national reconciliation. Next.
هذه تعطين تلفزيون سوري. كنت تتحدث عن بأن هناك العديد من المشاريع سوف تعودون أو تنشطونها بشكل أكبر بعد دخولكم يعني إلى سوريا. هل سيكون هناك شكل آخر للتدخل؟ نحن نعلم بأن هناك كان شكل تدخل وإسعافي مؤقت تقديم الغذاء. هل سيكون هناك مشاركات على مستوى إعادة أو تأهيل البنى التحتية؟ وأيضا تحدثت عن العقوبات. هل سوف يعني نشهد دور بالمساهمة بموضوع رفع العقوبات عن سوريا؟
Mohammed Jim Al Jazeera English. High Commissioner, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your conversation with Ahmed Shadar, head of the new administration, Did you ask for specific guarantees when it comes to ensuring that human rights be respected for minority groups? And also, could you just delve a little bit more into some of the conversations that you had with civil society organizations and how much help you'll be able to provide them, at least in the short term?
Hi, thank you, Lisa Golden from AFP. Did you raise or have the authorities expressed any openness to the idea of ratifying the International Criminal Court statute so that the perpetrators can be held to account there?
Yeah. So on the question of rehabilitation, I mean, obviously, I mean, if you look at the data, including destruction of schools, health facilities, as I mentioned, people below poverty line, there is a huge need to ensure that the economic and social, the access to basic services, the economic and social situation improves rapidly and very fast. And which is why I mentioned also in my statement the issue of sanctions. Because sectoral sanctions have had a negative impact on the enjoyment of rights of people, and the lifting of these sanctions should really be considered very actively. And I've said it publicly, I will continue making strong advocacy for that. On the issue of, what was the other one? Yeah, and sorry, on the issue of my conversations, well, obviously we discussed inclusivity and the importance of inclusivity, not least benefiting from the richness of the society. I mean, it's clear that society and the social cohesion within the country can only be guaranteed if indeed each and every part of that society is able to get on with their lives. And that includes each and every segment of the society. And indeed, we heard some very positive statements from the leadership in that regard. Of course, a lot now depends on how it's happening on the ground, and there's a lot of work to be done. It's a very fragile transition period, but it will be absolutely critical to support the effort to build a new Syria that overcomes the legacies of the past, including the divide and rule tactics of the past regime. Civil society, as I said before, I've rarely seen a population that coming out of a trauma that is very deep. I mean, I also feel that people after years of repression are realizing that now they can talk freely, for example. They can share their views, which is for some of them was actually quite hard in some of the meetings. I think there is a lot of healing work to be done to bring together also often very fractured societies. But I also have a real deep belief in the Syrian people to do this, to be able to do it. I have had a chance to meet many Syrian refugees in the past. I've seen also what transformation has gone on among them, and I believe that there is now a huge chance for the country to heal. We did not discuss specifically ICC accession to the statute. It was my first meeting, so it's obviously you cannot discuss each and every aspect of it. It is one area that was mentioned by civil society groups. They would possibly want to advocate for the ratification of the ICC statute.
Sorry. كثير عجيب وكانت الأسوشيتد بريس.
Have you?
هل عندك كثير عجيب وكانت الأسوشيتد بريس. هل هناك عدد تقريبي لعدد المعتقلين أو الذين قتلوا خلال الأزمة؟ وماذا ستفعلون؟ شكرا.
Questions? Yes.
مرحبا، أحمد غنام مفتش التلفزيون العربي لدمشق. يعطيكم العافية. تحدثت من خلال المؤتمر الصحفي عن موضوع المرأة والمساواة في العمل والتعليم قبل قليل، لكن هنا في سوريا يوجد ملف يخص المرأة وهو المعتقلات اللواتي تم اغتصابهن في السجون. هل هذا الملف سيثار دوليا في المحاكم الدولية أم لا؟ طبعا مع إشارة أن هناك الكثير من أحاديث السوريين أن النساء اللواتي تم اغتصابهن ليس لجريمة سياسية، إنما فقط لدرجة قرابة مع شخص يكون معارض أو مخالف للنظام السابق.
عديس الطروف وكالة ستيل. هناك مطالب شعبية كبيرة من المدنيين أو الناس هنا في سوريا بمحاسبة مرتكبي جرائم الحرب في سوريا. ما هو دوركم في هذه القضية وماذا ستفعلون في صدد محاسبة جرائم الحرب الذين كانوا ضمن صفوف قوات النظام؟
When it comes to the exact numbers of people who died and were killed, we have, of course, different figures that were provided, including by Syrian civil society organizations, but we don't have the exact figure. And I think this is part of the work that needs to be done, especially once we see how this new institution for missing persons works out. Hopefully it will give us more clarity to the numbers, but we do not at this point in time have the precise number. But it's important that it's being done. It's part of the transitional justice process that I mentioned before. Look, sexual violence, you have probably seen a number of reports that my office, but also the other human rights mechanisms have actually published over the last couple of years. It's been one of these horrific aspects of the conflict. There needs to be a very strong focus on survivors and healing of survivors. And even in one of the sessions that I had even here, I really admire the courage of those who speak about it. And I can see there is a strong willingness to not only bring it more out in the open, but also to make sure that those who were perpetrators, are called to account. When it comes to the broader issue of accountability, my office and the various mechanisms have in the past provided documentation that was used in national proceedings when it came to those who were accused of having committed atrocity crimes. And in some jurisdictions, I mean, as a lawyer, you probably are aware, it's called universal jurisdiction. When countries have universal jurisdiction, they have actually brought to justice a number of Syrian perpetrators in other, not inside Syria, outside Syria. And a lot of the documentation that came from my office, but also from the other institutions that I mentioned, were part of the proceedings. And it is now, of course, very important in the current context, as I said before, to preserve the evidence and to ensure that all the documents are kept, so that if there is a transitional justice process that works, including accountability mechanisms, that they are actually able to do its part. But transitional justice is not just accountability. It is also healing, memorialization, and truth-telling. That's equally important, and it has to have a very strong nationally owned character, because if it's not nationally owned and if it's not centered on the victims themselves and the survivors, we know from experience that it can fail. Maybe two more.
If we've no more questions, thank you very much. Okay, one last one, because we do have to go.
أحمد قرأ أحمد من وكالة أنبال الأناضول. يقولون كثيرون أن يجب أن تكون هناك محاسبة للجرائم ضد الإنسانية المرتكبة في سوريا. كيف سيتم تطبيق هذه الآلية ومن المسؤول
عن تفعيل هذه الآلية؟ وما هو الدور الذي ستلعبه الأمم المتحدة في هذا الصدد؟
Well, there is obviously a huge need to reform criminal justice in the country and to bring it in line with international human rights standards. And it's clear that you need to build up such a system, and we will be there to support the building up of that. That's precisely one of the roles that we hope we can play in support of the national authorities, in support of the national justice system, to ensure that there is compliance with human rights, because as we know, in the past there was a huge issue of due process, of lack of fair trial standards and so forth, and it's really going to be important to ensure that there is a massive reform in order to be able to deliver on the accountability front. Shukran jazilan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.